Well, good afternoon, everyone, and can I welcome everyone to what is unbelievably, our first in-person event since the pandemic began in 2020. So this actually feels like a really special day for us here at EDAS, for me, because I genuinely haven't been in a room with such a buzz for over 2 years. And not just because of who we have here in the room, but because we're together sharing the same space again at long last. Thank you, all of you, for being here this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Liz McIntyre, or you maybe know me from the shoulders up. That seems to be happening quite a lot in this room right now. But I'm Liz McIntyre, I'm chair of EDAS, and I took over as chair just as the pandemic began, which is why I've not had a chance to meet so many of you in person yet. And indeed, I'm here in that capacity today, chairing today's event. So many of you in the room will know that over the last 2 years, EDAS has been working closely with the Scottish Government and the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, CLES, to deliver a programme of learning that supports those working in and contributing to economic development to understand community wealth building and how it has been developed and initiated across the UK and in pilot areas across Scotland and now, of course, internationally, so that it can be taken forward widely across the country. Now, having worked closely with Neil, who's here today, on these events, I can say with confidence there is a huge appetite to embed community wealth building in the way that local economic development is delivered in Scotland. And at a time when people, communities and businesses are trying to recover from the impact of COVID, whilst facing significant financial challenges and cost of living increases, the need to ensure we maximise the use of local assets and resources for economic and social good has never been greater. Here at EDAS, we fully endorse and support this direction of travel in creating a fairer and more equitable society. So it's with huge excitement and not just a little bit of kind of awestruckness on my part, I think, that we have the pleasure in welcoming the man who started the community wealth building movement in the United States, I think over a decade and a half ago now. Ted Howard, President of the Democracy Collaborative, as well as the Minister, Tom Arthur, who's now leading the policy and legislative drivers needed for the rollout of community wealth building in Scotland. We're really looking forward to hearing what these key figures have to share with us today. And we have one slight change to today's agenda. We'll also hear from Neil, who was formerly the Chief Exec with CLES. But if you had an agenda, you'll see that we were due to hear from Phil Prentice from Scotland's Towns Partnership, but he's unfortunately not able to stay for the full session. But all this means is that we have a little bit more time for audience participation and questions from the floor and discussion. But before we begin, I'd like to thank Edinburgh City Council for hosting today's event in this really beautiful venue. And I'd like to introduce Councillor Paul Lawrence as the Executive Director of Place for the formal welcome. So can I bring you up here, Paul? Thank you.
Just for those of you who know me in the audience, a minor correction, not Councillor Paul Lawrence. Normally at these events, as local government colleagues will know, we would have a councillor here, but our councillors are still in the process of forming an administration. Indeed, I was saying before, we had our full council meeting today, which lasted 8 minutes because it was adjourned for a week to try and form an administration. So I'm the Director of Place at the council, so I'm an official rather than a politician, just to make that extremely clear. I just wanted to say two things because like meals kind of getting in the way between you and the main course. Firstly, to add with Liz, my welcome to the City Arts Centre today. Fantastic views, fantastic building, fantastic facility. Absolutely brilliant to see it buzzing with people. We are absolutely thrilled that we've been able to host this today. And secondly, perhaps more provocatively, I said I wanted to give a minor provocation. I think Neil got a little bit concerned. What I wanted to say was this, is that Edinburgh and the region, as colleagues from around the city region here today, is by most measures Scotland's most successful economy, on most measures. Yet, 1 in 4 children in this city live in poverty. 1 in 4. 25% of kids in this city go to private schools. So Edinburgh, on most measures, is the country's most successful economy. It's also the most polarised. And we live with the kind of policy consequences of that issue every day. And it's from that perspective that the community wealth building agenda is so welcome in a city like Edinburgh, and why we are so keen to embrace the opportunities and learn from the speakers today. So thanks very much and welcome once again.
Thank you, Paul, and apologies for elevating your status there, or maybe not. I'd now like to introduce Neil McInroy here today in his role as Community Wealth Building Advisor to the Scottish Government to set the scene for the afternoon and to provide some context. Neil is in many ways, as we know, the face of community wealth building here in Scotland and is a genuine and passionate advocate for the movement. He's been involved in progressive economic and public policy for the last 25 years, and as the Democracy Collaborative Senior Global Advisor and Community Wealth Building Fellow, he has been instrumental in bringing TED to Scotland for our visit. So we've got you to thank for that. Thank you, Neil. So over to you.
Thanks, Liz. It's lovely to actually be here in this EDAS event and also see these people that I'm used to not seeing in 3D. So it's fantastic. So thanks for all coming along. And it's kind of weird speaking here today as well because kind of two of my bosses are in the room, which is a bit freaky. So Ted's my boss, but also I suppose Mr. Ath's my boss too. So I don't know what I'm going to be saying because they'll be overlooking me what I'm talking about here. But in terms of my own journey around community wealth building, it's just worth noting that I first became aware of community wealth building around 2008 and 2009. And at that time, whilst there was a sense, I think, in our work at Cles, where I used to work, that we had economic development and regeneration was limited. It wasn't solving the true problems, the problems that Paul just outlined. And I became more and more interested in the work of Democracy Collaborative and the work of Ted, the founder of Democracy Collaborative, with his co-founder Gar Alpovitz. And we met about 10 years ago in London. He came over and we did a kind of head-to-head, didn't we, Ted? And I was gobsmacked, about when I heard what you had to say, and I thought, that's it, that's the new economic development. That's how you deal with the enduring, ingrained problems. That is economic system rewiring. Let's get a bit of that. And so from there, we brought those ideas over and we worked with Preston and other authorities in England. But it's brilliant now because Scotland is catching up and overtaking, if you like, what's happening in England around this agenda. I'll just also say that it's growing in Scotland and it's growing in the USA, and I have this weird thing where I'm one day working in the Bay Area, California, and then I'm going to Fife. It's virtually, it's really spooky, and you're thinking like, well, but they're not all that different. They're not that different because the same enduring problems of the economy exist. It's still economic hardship. There's still social and racial injustices as it is in the Bay Area. It's not just redistribution, it's about pre-distribution of wealth, giving people a genuine stake in the economy. It's not just a new name, community wealth building. It's about a different ethos and a different practice of how we actually deliver an inclusive economy for everyone in a particular locality. It's not just a job. It's not just getting people into a job. It's giving them a genuine stake in the economy. It's not just wages. It's given them a share in the economic activity and the economic endeavour. And Scotland is moving fast around this agenda. It's brilliant that it's happening and spearheaded in part by Mr. Arthur as well. Been a fantastic minister to work with. Me and Ted have been wandering around Scotland the last 4 or 5 days and more to come. And it's been great fun, but we've been busy. We've been in North Ayrshire. We've visited we've been to see Scottish Government officials, and they're in the audience today, Julie McLaughlin and Tracy Jackson. We've met STUC, we've met special advisors, we've met the community sector, we met Foundation Scotland. We've even been to see First Minister's questions today, which was great. I think Ted was laughing a lot at that. I thought it was great fun, great sport. So it's been great fun, and I'm taking Ted up to Scotland, around Scotland a wee break this weekend, and then we're off to Norway for other community wealth building chat in that fine nation. So I'll shut up. I've probably talked on far too long, as I do, and I'll pass you back to Liz. Liz.
Thanks, Neil. And having set the scene for us this afternoon, I'd like now to introduce Ted Howard, who is the president of the Democracy Collaborative to you all. Ted previously served as the executive director of the National Centre for Economic Alternatives. In 2010, Ted was appointed the Stephen Minter Senior Fellow for Social Justice at the Cleveland Foundation, a position he held for 4 years. Working with the Foundation, he was a member of a team that developed the comprehensive job creation and wealth building strategy, which resulted in the Evergreen Cooperative Initiative. I'm sure we're going to hear more about that this afternoon. So Ted, a really warm welcome to our event today. We're delighted to benefit from the wealth of knowledge and experience in leading the way for community wealth building to flourish and grow in Scotland that you're going to be bringing us. So, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Liz. I realized on Tuesday, when I was over in the Glasgow area, this is the first time since the before times, remember that before the pandemic, that I was actually with people in a meeting. It was really quite extraordinary. I can't tell you how many people I met on this trip that I've met on Zoom who've said, I had no idea you were so tall when I was with you on Zoom. So I want to begin by thanking the Economic Development Association of Scotland for inviting me here to participate in your meeting, Community Wealth Building, Delivering Positive Change for Scotland, and to our hosts, the City of Edinburgh Council, even though apparently they haven't formed themselves into a working government yet. It's good as well to see some really good friends, some that I met first in Monday and Tuesday this year in Glasgow who've come over. That's been lovely. But in particular, I wanted to acknowledge two colleagues with the Centre for Local Economic Strategies in Manchester, because without CLES, I suspect none of us would be sitting here for this event, and that's Rachel Bentley and Tom Lloyd Goodwin. It's particularly an honor, of course, to share this platform with Minister Tom Arthur, who I met in person for the first time today. And I want to make sure everyone's very clear that he is the world's first minister to have the term community wealth in his title. And that actually means something, and it communicates powerfully in the United States. So as Neil said, we've been here throughout this week conducting meetings and dialogues in North Ayrshire and Glasgow, and now here in Edinburgh with my colleague and comrade in arms. I don't know if some of you have probably had the opportunity to travel with Neil. If you haven't, you're really missing out. You should. I mean, it's, the most fun, the most odd phrases, the best beer, it's fantastic. So I know he's well known to many of you. But we've met a broad range of people across public, private sectors, including a number in the Scottish government, some of whom are here. I've been on this trip deeply impressed by the depth and scope of commitment to community wealth building in this country. A recognition among many that community wealth building is about true economic change, not just taking old-style economic development or old-style regeneration and just rebranding it, putting a new name on it, but doing the same thing. It seems to me people are quite clear that's not the goal of what we're up to here. I've learned much on this trip. First of all, I've learned that the weather in Edinburgh is vastly superior to Glasgow. Sorry for those of you that live on that side of the country. But more importantly, including how community wealth building builds on traditions of Scotland, traditions of land reform and strong communities and excellent public service, well established in your country's history. I've also been particularly pleased to see the ambition that is being advanced here around two very key priorities and visions, and that is the well-being economy and just transition, in both of which Scotland is a global leader. Quite literally, in the United States, you do not hear that conversation at all. And everywhere I've been, I've heard that conversation in Scotland. A number of people have said, well, how does community wealth fit in this? Is it a competing frame? How does it relate to well-being economy? And for me, and actually to many of my friends who are in the Well-Being Alliance, community wealth building can truly be the delivery mechanism for realizing these bold and brave visions. So I think, in my mind, it all fits together as a very much an integrated and coherent whole. Now, in my brief remarks today, I want to share with you some thoughts on the community wealth building journey that I and many others have been on for almost 20 years. I'm going to share with you my perspective. It's not the perspective. There are a lot of ways to think about community wealth building, and one of the great things on this trip is I've learned new frames and new ideas that fit in and amplify and make richer this term that we created some 15 or 20 years ago. And the journey has gone from the genesis of the idea of community wealth building that we first at the Democracy Collaborative identified, named in 2005. I remember literally going on the Google machine in those days and typing in quotes, community wealth building in 2005, and literally not a single thing came up. And if you were to do that today, you would see hundreds of thousands of citations of community wealth building around the world. So from that early naming of an idea through to its early application in the first prototype in Cleveland, Ohio, I'll tell you a bit about the Evergreen Cooperatives, toward more comprehensive models being implemented here in the United Kingdom, in Preston, Lancashire, and in Irvine in North Ayrshire, and I met some wonderful people from Clackmannanshire. Did I get that right? Yes. I was told I could just say Clacks. Is that okay enough? And I know there are also people from Fife here. All of those among communities in this in Scotland that are advancing community wealth strategies. And now to this historic moment, and I really would like for you to understand this, a historic moment in which nations, national governments, including yours and including mine in the United States, are beginning to embed community wealth building into governmental priorities at the highest level. This is an extraordinary advance that's just been occurring in the last year or so. Let me say just a couple words about what is community wealth building to me. It works to produce broadly shared economic prosperity through the reconfiguration of economic flows. There's all this money flowing around. How do we redirect it toward better ends? And the building of institutions, new types of institutions. We all know we have commercial banks and we have private equity firms and we have giant corporations. Those are institutions, and because they are, they make a big difference because they persist, they keep moving forward and shaping things. We need our own set of new kinds of institutions that can produce other outcomes. New institutions based on broad shared and democratic ownership, participation, and control. It's a new way of thinking about economic development, poverty alleviation, wealth creation, and accumulation. But its truly transformative potential, the truly transformative potential of community wealth building, is that it takes a full system view that focuses on developing alternative economic institutions, as I said, broadly owned, and creating new relationships between these institutions and between communities. The goal is not simply to build one-off projects, to build interesting models, initiatives, programs, a cooperative here, a social enterprise there, community-owned business, all of which I'm in favor of and are part of the fabric of community wealth building. But rather than be satisfied with that, or to be satisfied with tinkering around the edges of the economy we have to try to even out the malign effects of our current deeply unequal and unjust economic model, the goal here is to pursue fundamental changes to the ordinary operations of the system, our political economy, to literally rewire it such that it is capable of reliably generating positive outcomes just as a natural consequence of how the system works. In this, and I know this is an awkward word, I wish we had a better one, but in this community wealth building, rather than being redistributive, the system works, it creates all kinds of external problems, wealth inequality, climate problems, pollution, so forth. Then we try to clean it up on the back end. In this, community wealth building is pre-distributive. It attempts from the internal workings of the system to distribute the gains in a way that's just and equitable, rather than having to clean up problems that we've created. There are 5 key pillars of community wealth building that can be leveraged, and we could spend all day in a training about these, and we shan't. But just to name them, one pillar is plural ownership of the economy through forms of enterprise like cooperatives and employee-owned firms and community land trusts and so forth. A second is making financial power work for local places, targeting investment flows to really benefit communities, not extract wealth from them. Fair employment and just labor practices and markets, not just jobs, counting jobs, but good jobs, family-supporting jobs, dignified work. Progressive procurement of goods and services, you'll hear about that and what we did in Cleveland, how our public institutions can buy locally and in a way that can really support our communities rather than siphon money out of them, and get a multiplier effect for all of us. And finally, socially productive use of land and property. So that's some of the theory and design and the way I at least think about community wealth building. Let me turn now to the arc of its history. First, of course, there's nothing new under the sun. So we didn't just have big brains and look how smart we are, we invented this thing. Community wealth building draws on a rich, centuries-old set of traditions, but brings them together to meet our contemporary needs. We could go on, there are hundreds of these, and you'll have them for yourself, but let me tell you some of the traditions that I draw upon. The perspective of indigenous communities in America, in the Amazonian rainforest, wherever indigenous peoples live, who have a view that the land shouldn't be privatized, but should be held in common by the whole people of the tribe. It's a very different way of looking how to manage that asset. We could go all the way back to the Old Testament, to the biblical year of Jubilee, recounted in the book of Leviticus, in which every 50 years, it says in the Bible, people were released from their debts, all slaves were freed, and property was to be returned to its original owners. That's not Karl Marx. That's the Old Testament saying this. Or to the Rochdale pioneers in England who built the first consumer and worker cooperatives to protect themselves against the ravages of early industrialization in the 1840s. To freed slaves and their descendants in the United States South after the Civil War, who began cooperatives, and black farmers later during the U.S. Civil Rights Movement who created early forms of land trust. The early 20th century progressive movement in the United States that, among other reforms, built the first public bank, not a commercial private bank, the first public bank in the state of North Dakota, which incidentally is one of the most conservative states in America, has one of the most progressive banks that was built over 100 years ago. The Ujamaa philosophy that was the foundation of Julius Nyereri's social and economic policies in Tanzania, the early kibbutz experiments in Israel, today's large-scale worker cooperative movements in Mondragon, Spain, and Emilia-Romagna in Italy, and the co-op networks in Quebec in Canada. And of course, you will know many community wealth building antecedents here in Scotland that I'm not even familiar with. And I'd encourage you to get together and talk to people about that and write that down. That would be an interesting contribution. So as we sit here today in this lovely room, I hope you can feel the power, even perhaps the presence of our ancestors, all who worked on these powerful accomplishments over hundreds of years, and upon whose precedent and achievement we stand as we embark on community wealth building. Now, drawing upon this rich tradition and so much more, my organization, the Democracy Collaborative, as I said, we created a term of art, community wealth building. And we did so primarily for two reasons, and very briefly. One is we observed that in the United States, but in many other places, including here, there are many forms of non-traditional economic enterprise that were being developed, structures, activities, cooperatives, publicly owned firms, land trusts, community financial institutions, community-owned enterprises, and so much more. And all of these forms they're unique in their structure and incorporation and so forth, but they share in common a kind of shared vision and principles and values. And yet they were separated by silos. They weren't talking to one another. So we sought to create through community wealth building an overarching frame inside of which these distinct structures could link together, find common purpose, create synergy and greater impact. So that was the first reason we did it, to helpfully start to build a coherent movement advancing this going forward. And the second, and very importantly, is to create a new narrative, an economic strategy that could push back against the decades-long neoliberal model of trickle-down economics, financialization, and ever-escalating wealth inequality and climate crisis. This has been developed over the last 40 years. We needed a counterpoint to it, and one that hopefully, over time, will not just be the rational and good alternative, but can actually become the dominant paradigm for how we will govern and create the economies of our communities. Now, for the first few years, once we identified community wealth building as a kind of think tank, we carried out the kind of work that think tanks do. We did a lot of research, we did a lot of analysis, we wrote long reports that turned into 250-page PDFs that no one read. We did policy development. We're still doing some of that, despite what I ask my staff sometimes. Tracking data and so forth. But in 2009, we launched the first community wealth building prototype in Cleveland, Ohio. We were invited by the Community Foundation and others to come to Cleveland and see how would this theory of community wealth building be applied and what could be created as a result. So Cleveland, Ohio became a kind of learning laboratory for the first application of a coherent community wealth model. Very briefly, Cleveland, I don't know, has anybody been to Cleveland, Ohio? I know you've been there because your father is from there. Very good. So Cleveland in the 1950s and 60s was one of the wealthiest cities in America. It was one of the largest cities. It was a manufacturing powerhouse. And then decades of deindustrialization came along. Jobs were ripped from the community, and today it's one of the 3 poorest cities in America. So there's a big shift in Cleveland. About a third of the population lives below the poverty line established by the federal government. So we were asked by local philanthropy, the city government, and the city's major anchor institutions to devise a strategy to build wealth in low-income, disinvested neighborhoods in the city. These are neighborhoods that had 50,000 residents, half of whom lived below the poverty line in these areas, a very large percentage unemployed. We launched what were called the Evergreen Cooperatives. You may have heard of that. If you haven't, if you Google for Evergreen Cooperatives Cleveland, you will see scores of videos and stories and interviews with workers in the companies. These cooperatives are designed to provide goods and services to the large public institutions, hospitals, universities, who have agreed to move contracts that used to go to Chicago or to China or Mexico or wherever they went and move them back into the city to help start these businesses. They employ now hundreds and hundreds of residents in Cleveland, half of whom, in general times, half of whom were formerly incarcerated and therefore excluded from our economy. In the United States, we call these individuals returning citizens because they come out of prison back to their neighborhoods and they need decent work. The people in the companies are, each person owns a share of the company. They're equity owners. They receive family supporting living wages, profit sharing, housing support, elect from their membership on the floor plan, members to the board of directors of the company to help govern it, make decisions about how profits are allocated. Earlier this year, one of our companies is a large industrial scale commercial laundry, doing tens of millions of pounds of towels and sheets and so forth for the hospitals. Earlier this year, the workers in the company looked at the profits they'd made and voted themselves $10,000 bonuses for the year, which can be a life-changing amount of money in some of the neighborhoods we're talking about. Recently, Evergreen now has launched what they call the Fund for Employee Ownership. And rather than starting up new businesses, they're looking at existing small and medium businesses in Cleveland where the owners want to get out of the business because they're old like me and want to retire, but they don't have a succession plan. So the Evergreen comes in and buys the business, converts it into a worker cooperative. The wages of the workers improve, the benefits improve. The really next important community wealth building, evolutionary development, and LEAP came about here in the United Kingdom, far in advance of what we were able to do in Cleveland to date. And that was primarily in the city of Preston in Lancashire, in the north of Britain, but in many other places as well. Preston, if you've never been there, is what in England would be called by some a left-behind place. It took up the Cleveland model, it radically expanded it, and turned it from a neighborhood initiative into a full citywide economic strategy. Very briefly, the Preston Council, which has led this, has worked with the anchor institutions there to convince them to bring, and CLES was essential to this. Again, CLES, this would never have happened without CLES's good work. It's convinced the anchor institutions to bring over 75 million pounds of contracts back to the local community, more than 1,000 million pounds back to Lancashire County, all of which used to leave the system, investing public employee pension funds to the tune of 100 million pounds, not in the city in London, taking it out of there and placing it into High Street in Preston, partnering with the University of Central Lancashire to incubate cooperatives, and much, much more. And in just 8 years, this strategy has saved or created several thousand jobs, it's estimated. Unemployment has fallen, and Preston has also achieved above average improvements for health, transport, work-life balance, youth and adult skills. A city that was once in the bottom 20% of the most deprived communities in England has now been named by PricewaterhouseCoopers, you know, that radical far-left organization, as the most improved community in the nation for 2 years in a row. Now, one can't say it was only through community wealth building, but I dare say without that central strategy in the city, they would never have achieved that. Other parts of the UK are now following Preston's lead. You're probably well aware of North Ayrshire. I've mentioned a couple other of the areas. Also in Britain, Wirral, north of Tyne, Newham, Islington, many others are moving in this direction. In these and other places, what once seemed like a fringe idea, remember, you go to the Google and no one had ever heard of community wealth building, this idea has now moved fast toward the mainstream. A new way of thinking about how local government and residents can take control of their local economies. The Democracy Now! Collaborative now, from lessons we've learned from here in Scotland and in England, we've taken those lessons back to the United States and are now working with cities, and Neil's heading this up, major cities like Chicago, the third largest city in the United States, and working with this network of new cities on building their own community wealth building strategies. Last year, we were approached by the City of Chicago's Office of Equity and Racial Justice to help them conceive and implement a comprehensive community wealth building strategy. If fully realized over time, this program will position Chicago as a national leader in equitable, inclusive, and sustainable development. New York City has issued a very interesting publication called The City of New York's Government Policies for Municipal Community Wealth Building. If you want to Google for that, you could download that. It's a very interesting strategy. And now the U.S. federal government, its largest funder of economic development, called the Department of Housing and Urban Development, with a 2022 budget of $68 billion, has embraced community wealth building in their new 4-year strategic plan. There has just been a formal government announcement of this. Money is going to start flowing, perhaps tens of billions of dollars, into community wealth building. And at the Democracy Collaborative, we're looking forward at working with them. They've asked us, they've told us, we need you to help us do this and help form this program. And we're looking forward to that. And in particular, we're going to be loading Neil up with a huge amount of work in order to do that. So let me conclude with this. Because of the successes we're seeing in places like Cleveland, in the US, in Preston, North Ayrshire, and others here in the UK and in Scotland, in particular, and the expansion of community wealth building to other communities like Chicago, like Sydney, Australia, and elsewhere. Because of the embedding of community wealth building as a powerful framework for economic development that in the governments of the US and Scotland, at least that process is right in front of us, because of the iniquities of all of our political economies so brutally revealed by the last 2 years of the pandemic, because of the growing recognition that we simply cannot continue on with business as usual or be satisfied with tinkering at the margins in the face of the climate crisis, ever-growing inequality, and the anti-democratic consolidation of power as private equity buys up our assets, our wealth, our communities. Because of all these things and more, community wealth building has grown from a simple idea, the idea that whoever owns and controls assets and capital determines the type of economy we have and who benefits from it, into the beginnings of a truly global movement to transform the practice of economic development and reorient our living local economies capable of producing radically different outcomes. And Scotland, if it is bold and brave, and I believe from my experience here, the people of Scotland are bold and brave on this matter, can and rightfully should be recognized as being at the forefront of this global movement for fundamental economic transformation. And we at the Democracy Collaborative stand ready to help in any way we can and to create learning and contacts with colleagues in the United States who are doing this same work so that we can mutually learn from one another. The great physicist and Nobel laureate Albert Einstein once said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." Never were these words truer than they are today. Let us think and act newly and boldly together as we build democratic local economies and as we build a truly global community wealth movement for the next stage of our shared history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ted. That was a really measured, thoughtful, comprehensive, and inspiring contribution. I think everyone in the room would have felt that. And it certainly feels as though community wealth building, the movement, its time has come. You know, right now is the time for this. So I think I certainly, I've got that sense from hearing you today. So thank you for that. Now, I'd like to move on to our other very special guest this afternoon. And I want to welcome Tom Arthur, MSP and Minister for Public Finance, Planning and Community Wealth, to share his thoughts and observations on Scotland's future and the place of community wealth building as part of that vision. And I believe it's a special day for you as well, Tom, which you might want to share with the audience. Okay.
Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you so much for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. It's so fantastic to actually be at an in-person event again, and particularly the opportunity to meet so many people who I've only been able to converse with over a computer screen. And that's been the case since my appointment for the last year, because as I was reminded this morning, it was a year ago today that I was appointed, and one of the first tweets I received upon a public announcement of my appointment was, "You are the first minister in the world to have the community wealth title." So no pressure, no responsibility. But in a sense, there isn't pressure in some sense because there is such enthusiasm and energy, and it is a bottom-up grassroots movement. And it's an international movement. And I want to sincerely thank Ted for what was, a measured and considered and detailed contribution, but I thought utterly inspiring as well. And I think that captures the energy of where we are right now, not just in Scotland, but right across the world, from Cleveland to Clackmannanshire. And I think as well, the need to seize this moment. There are particular turning points in economic history. 1933 in the United States, 1945 in the United Kingdom, 1979 in the UK and internationally for other reasons. And I think as we come out of the experience of the pandemic, there's an opportunity have another turning point, and that turning point is the moment for community wealth. Now, as you'll be aware, community wealth building was adopted by the Scottish Government as a practical means to deliver on our wellbeing economy objectives, helping to build an economy in which all people in Scotland can enjoy greater wealth, health and opportunity. Ownership and a greater stake in the economy supports people and communities to be resilient, retain and create fair work employment opportunities, and can help address inequalities that some of our communities face. We recently published our 10-year National Strategy for Economic Transformation. This strategy will put us on a path to a net zero economy, restore the natural environment, stimulate innovation, create new jobs, and further embed fair work principles. We must take a broader view of what it means to be a prosperous economy, society, and country, moving beyond traditional attitudes and measures of growth. People and the environment must be at the heart of our economic activity. Labour and land must also be at the heart of our economic activity. As Ted alluded to, it is vital that we build upon these strong international connections developed through the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and show that community wealth building is the practical means to achieve a wellbeing economy. Our 2021 programme for government confirmed our plans to introduce legislation on community wealth building in this parliamentary session. The community wealth building model allows us to turn the dial in very practical terms, providing a framework against which we can embark on a process of reform to restructuring our local economic systems. It is important to emphasise that this is not rebadging, but a bold rewiring of our economic system. The legislation we plan to introduce will address blockages and barriers identified through engagement with local authorities implementing community wealth building and other anchor organisations. It will empower anchor organisations to see themselves as economic agents. By focusing on each of the community wealth building pillars, they can recognise levers under their control, exert influence over their local economy, and embed community wealth building as standard practice to maximise benefits for our people, businesses, and places. Many of you will be aware of the work underway in our pilot areas in Clackmannanshire, south of Scotland, Western Isles, Tay Cities, Fife, and Glasgow City region, as well as in North Ayrshire and the wider Ayrshire region through the Growth Deal. Through my role as the Minister for Public Finance, Planning and Community Wealth, I have had the pleasure of witnessing community wealth building in action. On a recent visit to the Western Isles, I had the opportunity to talk to people in communities benefiting from the community wealth building approach. In the village of North Tolsta, I saw how the revenue from a community-owned wind turbine was being used to support a number of local jobs and important community organisations within the village. I attended a meeting of the Ayrshire Community Wealth Building Commission, where the Ayrshire anchor organisations took the time to outline their progress so far, including through the Ayrshire Anchor Charter and the ambitious plans they have going forward. I met with the Glasgow City region to hear about progress in vacant and derelict land and procurement practices, and I was heartened to hear how individual local authorities are driving community wealth building in their localities, as well as through a collaborative regional approach. The South of Scotland Enterprise Agency have shared with me their work with local registered social landlords to develop local supply chains for green retrofitting of housing stock. In meetings with Clackmannanshire Council and Fife Council, I've heard about their respective work focusing on employability and developing supply chains which will create more local employment opportunities. And I recently attended a Community Land Scotland parliamentary reception which highlighted the fantastic work underway across Scotland to promote community ownership of land and the benefits that can be derived for local economies and communities. I see enormous potential in the community wealth building model, and I'm very keen that its practicality is demonstrated and proven as we consider legislation for implementing the approach in Scotland. I therefore believe that legislation should be driven from the bottom up, learning from the work already underway and considering how we can be as ambitious as possible for community wealth building in Scotland. I was extremely heartened to hear and witness the energy and enthusiasm generated by community wealth building and our plans for legislation at our inaugural Bill Steering Group meeting recently. And I'm especially looking forward to the opportunity to debate community wealth building in the Scottish Parliament next week. I truly believe that we have a real opportunity to make a tangible difference for the lives of people in our communities across Scotland. And I welcome the opportunity to collaborate to achieve that. This is not just about government, it's not just about local authorities, this is a shared endeavour, but we have a historic opportunity to really realise the vision and the hope and the moral imperative that is implicit within the idea of a well-being economy. So I am delighted to have all of your support as we push ahead in the next phase of our community wealth building journey in Scotland. So I want to end by echoing Ted's comments. We must be bold and innovative in the development of the legislation so that we realise the full potential of community wealth building. The time for community wealth building in Scotland has come. Let's seize that opportunity. Thank you.